And welcome to this episode of Israel Now podcast, presented to you by Patmos Foundation. Today I have a great honor to have with me Richard Kemp, Colonel Richard Kemp, who has spent most of his life fighting terrorism and insurgency, commanding British troops on the front line of some of the world's toughest hotspots, including Afghanistan as a commander of British forces there in 2003. From 2002 and 2006, he was in the British Prime Minister's office, heading the international terrorism team at the Joint Intelligence Committee. Concurrently, he served as a chairman of the Strategic Intelligence Group at COBRA, the UK National Crisis Management Committee. Colonel Kemp, it's an honor to have you on the Israel Now podcast. Welcome.
A great pleasure to join you. Thank you for inviting me.
You are presently in Israel, is that right?
I am, yes. I've been here since the 9th of October.
Right. You have been there. I remember seeing you in various news outlets commenting the conflicts that Israel has had with Gaza for over 10 years' time. And I remember especially your interview with BBC, where you stated that Israel has done more than any other army in the history of modern warfare to avoid civilian casualties. And we'll get to the casualty issue briefly soon. But how does this war differ from the other conflicts that you've witnessed there in the years behind us?
Well, I think this is certainly the most intensive and lengthy conflict that I've seen in Israel in my time over here. Of course, the only other conflict that compares to this in length was the 1948 War of Independence. Otherwise, they've all been quite short. But this one has been going on now, as you know, for more than 4 months, and probably is going to go on for quite a while longer. But it's one of the major differences is that previously the IDF decided, in response to previous assaults by Hamas and Islamic Jihad against the Israeli civilian population, decided to launch either limited ground offensives to protect themselves or just air offensives. This time they've gone beyond the limited. They've made the decision to achieve total victory over Hamas, which means the destruction of Hamas as an entity that can possibly threaten Israel, and also the removal of Hamas as the governing body over Gaza. And that, of course, has led to the length of time it takes to destroy an organization which has maybe 30, 40,000 fighters and numerous missiles. And then, of course, and we can talk about it maybe a bit later if you wish, there's the immense complexity of this battlefield. It's probably the most treacherous and dangerous and complicated battlefield that any army has ever fought on. And I don't compare it to something like some of the major battles of the Second World War, like Stalingrad or something, or even Bakhmut in Ukraine. I was in Ukraine a few times during this war, and I observed the conflict there. And although much more intense, many more casualties, those battles are far more straightforward, being army on army. One of the complexities of this war is that it's a conventional armed force fighting against terrorists, effectively a terrorist army. It's not just kind of a standard terrorist group, but a terrorist army that hides in among its own civilian population and uses human shields as a part of its policy.
I appreciate this, what you were telling us, because we who are following far off from where the actual battle is happening, it's for many it is difficult to comprehend how difficult a task Israel is facing at the moment. So how would you open up the difficulties that Israel is facing in this combat?
Well, the first thing to say is that urban conflict, and most of the war is being fought in urban areas. Urban conflict is well understood by every professional soldier and anyone who studies warfare to be among the most difficult and demanding forms of war, with normally the highest casualty rates on both sides, particularly on the side of the attackers, and a very high ammunition expenditure rate as well is another characteristic of urban conflict. That's the baseline you've got. On top of that, you have a battlefield that's been prepared over many decades by Hamas to kill as many Israelis as possible that should enter the territory. And that includes things like booby traps, minefields, rat runs created in among buildings to allow terrorists to get towards the enemy and then escape safely. It includes pre-recce, pre-planned sniper positions, and it includes ambush positions and a plethora of other complications which make it extremely deadly. And then, in addition to all that, you've got an extensive tunnel network underneath Gaza. The urban areas of Gaza are almost replicated below ground as they are above ground. So you've got what would amount to underground streets connecting to each other in many cases. I've been into some of these tunnels underneath Gaza, and they are incredibly impressive feats of engineering, all constructed using money, or mostly constructed using money supplied by Western nations and Middle Eastern countries as well, in the form of aid, which has been used on constructing these tunnels instead of providing for the welfare and well-being of Gazan citizens. And those tunnels, they're very difficult to fight. And I don't think any army's ever had to fight in a tunnel network quite like this. They're very well prepared with concrete walls, concrete floors, concrete ceilings. They've got positions to carry out sniper attacks against people coming down the tunnels. They're booby trapped in almost every single case in numerous places, and they have, many of the tunnels have very heavy blast walls and blast doors, which make it even more complicated for the IDF to deal with. Then on top of that, you've got an enemy that operates, as I mentioned before, among the civilian population, wearing civilian clothes. They don't wear uniform. Very often when they're moving above ground in particular, they're not armed even, because they obviously, if someone moving around armed is an immediate target for the IDF. They don't carry the weapons usually. They can go from building to building, street to street, and there they will find weapons. Almost every house has weapons stashes, grenades, explosives, rocket launchers, have all the stuff that they need to operate from without being seen before they get to without becoming legitimate targets before they get to the battle positions. And you know, again, I've been into these houses inside Gaza a few times since the conflict began, and there are so many which have been prepared with either places, concealed places to shoot from, as I mentioned, lots of weapons, things like that. On top of that, you've then got a large civilian population. That makes it very complicated to kill the enemy while trying to minimize civilian death. Then you have something that's, again, not necessarily unique, but extremely unusual, which is a very large number of hostages, Israeli hostages, in among the population in tunnels, in houses around the city, or around the strip, which makes it even more difficult. It means that the IDF have to operate with even greater caution. And finally, you've got the spotlight of the world, in a way, an intensive way that doesn't exist anywhere else, with media, with human rights organizations, with international bodies like the UN and the EU, many of them absolutely desperate to find Israel committing war crimes. So all of those things make it a very, very difficult battlefield to fight on.
Colonel Kemp, help us to understand these complexities in light of the international law and in terms of proportionality, which is often brought up in these cases. And we know the casualty figures are tens of thousands at the moment. How would you comment on those casualty figures and the proportionality issue?
Well, I think proportionality is something that's misunderstood very often by the media and by human rights groups, even people like the Red Cross and others who are actually supposed to be experts in this area. But when we talk about proportionality, we're not talking about kind of proportionality of casualties. So let's say, I don't know how many casualties have occurred inside Gaza. The figures given by the Gaza Health Authority are, of course, the figures that Hamas tell them to give. So, because of course they're part of Hamas. So we can't rely on them. But let's say tens of thousands have been killed in this conflict so far. And what is not understood really. Sorry, and you take that figure, you take that, let's say tens of 20,000, whatever it might be, and you compare it to 1,200 killed by Hamas in Israel. That figure is not relevant to anything. That comparison, in my opinion, in the law, the defending country, in this case Israel, is not required to say kill 1,200 Gazans and then Gazan terrorists and then withdraw and say, right, we've avenged those 1,200. It's not about that. It's not about avenging it. What's required is enough physical force, enough death and destruction of terrorists to defeat the threat to Israel. That's all that's required. Obviously, there are excuse me. Obviously, there are rules within that, but that's not what proportionality is. A lot of people quote that. The proportionality rule of law of war, rather. What that means is that a combatant force like the IDF has to make a proportionality calculation if they're carrying out operations in areas where there is civilian population. It doesn't apply if there are no civilians. And that proportionality calculation essentially means that a commander on the ground or in the air or wherever the commander might be, low level, high level, has to make a calculation about, is this target necessary? Is it necessary I attack this target if civilians might get killed? Yes, it's an important military target. Then he has to consider, if I attack this target, how many civilians are likely to die as a consequence? And he has to then weigh up in his mind whether the number of civilians that he thinks might die is proportionate to the value of his military objective. In other words, how significant this objective is. Now, there's no science behind this. You can't say, if I hit a rocket launcher and I kill 10 civilians, that's proportionate. If I kill 100 civilians, that's disproportionate. There's no such calculation. There's no such scientific method to it. It's a decision that he has to make at the time. And sometimes the decision is taken in an operations room in Tel Aviv, directing air operations against Hamas. Sometimes it's taken by a corporal on the ground, deciding whether to fire a tank or a rocket into a building in which there are civilians as well as terrorists present. So it's a split-second decision. Sometimes I've been in a position where I've made those decisions. You don't have much time to think and calculate, and also the other important thing is you don't actually know what the number of civilian casualties you might inflict is. You've got on the basis of the information you've got, you can work it out roughly, but and the law does not require that the effects you produce are proportionate. What the law requires is that the decision you take and your intention is proportionate. So you might think there's only one civilian there might be five. You kill five instead of one, by not as a deliberate intent, but as a byproduct of destroying this target, and that wouldn't make it disproportionate. So this is a topic for a much longer discussion, I think. But I would say that in terms of the casualty figures that we've got, that we're aware of, as I said, we don't know how many have been killed in Gaza so far, and the Hamas figures that are given are just raw figures. They don't include, for example, civilians versus combatants. I think they try and persuade us that most, if not all, of the casualties are civilians, which of course is nonsense. They don't say how many of the figures that they give are people that Hamas have themselves deliberately killed, which is a large number, nor indeed do they say how many are results of Hamas rockets which have dropped short inside a civilian population, which is a large number of them. So it's hard to use those figures, but on the basis of what I understand at the moment and the assessment that the IDF has made, which is about 12 to 15,000 terrorists have been killed in this operation, on the ground operation so far, that the ratio of civilians to military deaths is around about 1.5 civilians for every terrorist killed. It may be more than that, it may be less than that, but that's what I believe to be roughly the case now. It sounds awful reducing human life to statistics, but it is, I think, an important thing to do when trying to bring some form of reality to the anti-Israel propaganda. And if you say, people might say, 1.5 civilians to every combatant killed is terrible. It is terrible. Every civilian death is terrible. But the UN put out a report a few years ago saying that in urban conflict around the world since the Second World War, the average number of civilian casualties is 9 to 1 combatant. That's a disputed figure, but that was a report. In Afghanistan and Iraq, the estimate is that US and British and other allied forces killed between 3 and 5 civilians to every 1 combatant, which I think if these figures are correct, and we may find out, after the war's over whether they are, but if they are, then it certainly seems to me that the IDF are achieving a much lower civilian to combatant casualty ratio than most other armed forces.
Right. And when you consider the fact that we talked earlier that they are operating in an unusually and exceptionally difficult circumstances and they are able to perform like this, it is really, what can we say, exceptional in one way, professional, if you can say that.
I agree. And let's not forget that there's another challenge that the IDF have in minimizing civilian casualties, and that's that unusually Hamas want Israel to kill Gazan civilians. That's what they want. That's their main objective in this. They obviously don't want their own fighters to die because they need them to fight. They don't mind how many civilians die. They want more civilians to die because that way they can then cause the delegitimization of Israel, the isolation, the criticism. They can, create world condemnation, which we've seen it works. They do it every single time. They attack. It's their policy. And it's very successful. And we're seeing it all over the world today. We're seeing Israel condemned for something that actually they're not doing. They're being extremely cautious. They're using the most extensive measures that I think any army has ever developed to minimize civilian casualties.
Colonel Kemp, how would you describe, and when you follow this war since the beginning, there seemed to be a brief moment of awakening in the world about because of the horrific nature and the barbaric nature of Hamas attack, and there was a lot of sympathy towards Israel, but it seemed to evaporate in a week or two. So help us understand, what should people who follow the news know more about this situation, and what should we think about this?
Well, it was entirely predictable. I mean, I think we were all absolutely horrified. Most people, not all, but most people around the world were absolutely horrified by what happened on the 7th of October. But this must be seen against a backdrop of a decades-long campaign of anti-Israel propaganda, which began in the 1960s. It began, I think, in 1964. And actually, although I won't bore you with the details, I'm sure your viewers and listeners can check it out. I've written an article about it myself on an organization called Gatestone Institute. But it began in the Kremlin in Moscow. Mm-hmm. It was a KGB operation in concert with Egypt to turn what was a religious conflict, Muslims against, or Arab Muslims against Jews who didn't want there to be a Jewish state. That wasn't considered by the Kremlin to be necessarily the kind of conflict that would garner Western support. So they deliberately turned it from that into a war of national liberation. They created a Palestinian people which hadn't existed. The people existed, of course, but they didn't regard themselves as Palestinians until this propaganda campaign began. Huge numbers of rubles spent in, billions of rubles spent inside the Middle East to try and create this, which effectively, and it was like many other Soviet wars of national liberation that they created. This was probably their most successful propaganda campaign. And it basically meant that it said Israel has stolen Arab land. It's illegally occupied Arab territory. It's illegally settled Arab territory. It's an apartheid state. It's a genocidal state. It has no right to exist. And this is the message that exists in so many places around the West. It got through. It's been going on for decades, and it continues. And therefore, anything that happens to Israel, like the 7th of October, terrible though it may be, Israel asked for it. Israel had it coming. And anything that Israel does in response to it, to defend itself, Israel is in the wrong. And that's why you see, after these decades of campaigning, that's why you see so many people around the world, including the media and international groups, you see them condemning everything Israel does, forgetting what happened on the 7th of October, forgetting that as we speak now, there is over 100 Israeli hostages still being held inside the Gaza Strip, forgetting all of that and just focusing on what Israel's doing and condemning it for being illegal and war crimes, apartheid, genocide, all of the rest of it.
This is most interesting. I remember reading your article on this, and I would highly recommend it to our viewers. It's really opened a new front in the information warfare, if I can so say. But this brings us also to the question that we are dealing with a larger geopolitical issue here. How would you comment on how Iran is involved in this situation?
Iran is behind this whole war, absolutely, directly, firmly, 100% behind this war. And Iran, over decades, has built up a network of proxy terrorist organizations all around the Middle East to protect it, to defend itself in its eyes against the United States and against Israel. The United States being the primary target, Israel, which Iran believes to be an imperial proxy of the US, of course, completely untrue. But it's designed so that Iran does not have to directly take military action itself. It can use its proxies, and the proxies include Hamas in Gaza. They include Islamic Jihad in Gaza, Hezbollah up in Lebanon, a range of proxies in Syria, proxies inside the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, proxies even now being built up inside Jordan, proxies in Iraq, proxies in Yemen, proxies all around the region with increasing capability to attack Israel and indeed to attack US forces in the region, which they've done. I think there's been something like 160, 180 separate attacks by these proxies against US forces in Iraq and Syria since this war in Gaza began. So Iran is right behind the whole thing. And it's been encouraged, unintentionally, I believe, but encouraged by the United States and its allies to build these proxies up. And the encouragement has come from appeasement of Iran due to fear of Iran gaining nuclear weapons. And Iran is close now to having nuclear weapons. And that appeasement has led, for example, the US and its allies to unfreeze frozen Iranian assets, which can then be used to help fund the proxy groups, including Hamas and Hezbollah. And not only that, but the way that the US has responded to attacks on its own forces, not just since this war began, but prior to that, as part of their appeasement effort, Iran's basically seen it as a green light to keep going. They've not been decisively attacked since President Trump killed Qasem Soleimani, the leader of the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which organizes this whole thing during his tenure. And the other point to note as well, which your listeners will, I think, also be interested in, your viewers, is the relationship between Russia and Iran and Russia and these proxies. And of course, Russia, I was in Ukraine myself just shortly before this war began, and I was under attack. I'm not suggesting direct attack on me, but I was in areas in Ukraine which were under attack from Iranian-supplied drones fired into Ukraine. I came to Israel, and I was in areas which were being attacked by Iranian-supplied rockets. Iran has become one of the major providers of munitions to Russia, and it doesn't just end there either. And by the way, Russia has also supplied weaponry to Iran. It doesn't just end there. Russia and Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah have relationships. There were Islamic Jihad and Hamas terrorist leaders in Moscow a few months before this war began. They've also been to Moscow during the war. Same with Hezbollah. And, Wagner, the Wagner group, the Russian Wagner mercenary group, for example, fought alongside and helped train Hezbollah forces fighting in Syria for many years. There's little doubt that Wagner or some other Russian entity is still supporting Hezbollah now in Lebanon. And of course, let's not forget that Hezbollah have been quite significantly attacking Israel since this war began as well. And there is speculation, I don't have any information myself about it, there is certainly speculation that Russia has been involved in directly supporting Hamas and Islamic Jihad in this war.
And now they are going to Moscow again, Hamas and Fatah, trying to negotiate there. Colonel Kemp, I really appreciate your time, and I would love to keep you many more hours with me. But in closing, back to Gaza, how close are we to victory from Hamas, and what would that look like?
Well, I think we're getting close. I mean, one thing I would say is that the IDF have fought this war with incredible skill and courage. And they have, the expectation by now was that the IDF would have incurred upon themselves thousands of deaths. That hasn't happened. There's more than 100 IDF have been killed in Gaza. But if you compare it to the number of Hamas that have been killed and the fact that the attacking force is Israel, and the attacking force, as I mentioned before, normally sustains significantly more casualties than the defending force, I think that ratio, that kind of comparison alone shows how extremely successful the IDF have been. They've killed thousands of terrorists, they've destroyed many tunnels, they've destroyed vast quantities of munitions, and they've advanced from north to south down the Gaza Strip. They're now on the verge of attacking the final enclave, the final bastion of Hamas, if you like, in Rafah. That is going to be a more complex battle, I think, in some ways, because of the vast number of civilians that are there. On the other hand, and of course, the IDF they have plans to try and move as many civilians out as they can. But on the other hand, they've also gained a lot of intelligence during this war so far, and they know much more about how Hamas operates. They've been able to map the tunnel network underneath Rafah far more effectively than previous tunnel networks. And it's the tunnels really that have slowed things down to such a great extent. And a lot of the intelligence they've got, of course, it's come from computers and things, but it's also come from Gazan civilians who also, in some cases, I know Hamas enjoys very large level of support from Gazan civilians, but some of them want Hamas removed. And they have given information to the IDF. And also many Hamas prisoners have been taken, and those prisoners have been, in many cases, very willing to give up valuable intelligence to the Israelis. So I think that the ground is set for that final, shall we say, showdown in Rafah. After that is complete, and I'm confident that at some point that will happen, even after maybe a pause due to a deal to release hostages. I think it's going to happen, I'm sure. And when it does happen, that will represent the destruction of Hamas as a terrorist entity, as a kind of coherent army, if you like. It's already largely completed. And then, of course, and that will prevent Hamas from, as an entity, being a significant threat to Israel, which is something close to victory. Then, of course, there's going to be a need for and that could be maybe in weeks, we could see the end of that. Maybe it might take longer. But then, of course, we've got a big clearing up operation to do, destroying tunnels that haven't so far been destroyed, destroying munitions, rounding up, hunting down Hamas terrorists that have survived, that haven't been killed or captured, and preventing the rise of Hamas too, which will certainly be on the cards. There will be a low-level insurgency inside Gaza from the time that Hamas is destroyed. That will continue, and it has to be suppressed, and that will require a long-term Israeli Defense Force presence inside Gaza. I'm not talking about running the strip, managing it, dealing with reconstruction or anything like that. I don't know how that'll work out, but I am very sure that the IDF will have to maintain a significant security presence in Gaza for the foreseeable future.
And I guess the long-lasting view of peace needs also some kind of thoroughgoing de-radicalization, because the society in Gaza seems to be very, very heavily having this violent culture on the streets towards Israel.
Absolutely right. And, this same culture exists in Gaza, it exists in Judea and Samaria, and exists in a much lower level inside Israel itself among some of the Arab population. But interesting to note that the population of Arab Israelis in Israel proper, shall we say, they've gone in the other direction since this war began. Right. Polling shows that the number of Arab Israelis who support Israel and who want Israel to defeat Hamas has risen exponentially since the war began, which I think is an encouraging sign. But returning to Gaza, I mean, people say, oh, well, after this very destructive war, the Gazan citizens will hate Israel even more. Well, they already hated Israel intensively. They've been indoctrinated, brought up almost from birth to hate Israel, to hate Jews. That, you might say that might be ratcheted up a bit here and there, but the feeling has been there already. So there would be in the ideal world, there would be a desire to de-radicalize Gaza and also to de-radicalize the Arabs in the West Bank, the Palestinians in the West Bank. But how realistic is that? I'm not overly optimistic that there's going to be, maybe if it's possible over several generations, and it can't be done by Israel. It can't be done by the United Nations. If anyone's going to achieve the de-radicalization of Palestinians, it's going to have to be done by countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, who have enormous experience at de-radicalization. But I don't know, A, whether they're willing to do it, and B, whether it's actually even possible to achieve it.
Right. Colonel Richard Kemp, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your insights. It's been absolutely interesting, one of the most interesting times I've had during this conflict to talk with you. And stay safe, and God bless.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure.